Hi, this is Dr. V, and I'm going to begin a four-part lecture on Frenau and Irving. This is Philip Frenau and Washington Irving. You can see them here depicted on the screen with Frenau on the left and Irving on the right. Irving did live long enough to have his portrait taken. We had the advent of the daguerreotype in America in 1839. That's when people actually started having their pictures taken. So you'll see some changes. One of the things I wanted to show you is just kind of a funny little bit, but I was looking for images of Washington Irving, and I came across quite a few, and I wanted to just drag this over to show you for a little comic effect here at the beginning of this lecture. Look at our fantasy version of Washington Irving versus the reality. Quite a difference there that we can see just looking at the top row of images, and that high romanticism that we see depicted with the swirled curls around his head, and the um, jacket, and the neck piece, that the scarf in his shirt that comes all the way up to the top when we see him there as a young man, stylized and considered this is supposed to be like the hot Irving versus the, well, actual Irving that we see in the portrait that was taken, that was a photograph. All right, let's take a look now at Frenau. We're going to start with Frenau and his poetry. So Frenau, his dates are January 2nd, 1752 to December 18th, 1832. This is relevant and worth consideration because we have Frenau's birth and death date, putting him as a young man during the time of the American Revolution. We have him spanning this period in American literary history, where we see his writings falling inside of the time periods of the Enlightenment or rationalism, and also in Romanticism. I'd like to talk about some context setting with Frenau's work. Frenau, let me hide this little bit here at the bottom. When you're reading Frenau, the biographical information that's at the front end of the reading is important. And there's some overlap with some other lecture material in the class, which is the reason actually for the image that I have here, which is a contemporary image, of course, about authors making money. The earlier writers we read in this class, they did make money, but not for a living. Frenau hoped to, but didn't. Irving did better than Frenau, making money. Both of them were hoping to support themselves with their writing. I wanted to mention there is some overlap with British Literature 1 and 2 again, as it's taught at ODU. We have Frenau writing in the Augustan style. Augustan is a style most often associated with the poetry of Alexander Pope, a British poet, very popular in the 18th century. But Frenau also has some characteristics in his poetry of the British Romantics that we see, a la Coleridge, Wordsworth, and so on, if you're looking for some context there. He did use heroic couplets that overlaps nicely with the Phyllis Wheatley lecture. Frenau also used lyrical style. The lyrical style that expresses emotions and the feelings of the speaker is much more closely associated with Romanticism, and we have both in Frenau's poetry. I did want to point out that bit about how he died in the biographical information is disturbing and sad. Lost in a blizzard, pretty terrible. Other noteworthy things from the biography: that he taught school for a while. He worked as a secretary at a plantation in the West Indies. That's important because of this To Sir Toby poem, one of his most famous poems that I assigned, because we know that he had firsthand experience of the plight of enslaved people. Frenau is often called the poet of the American Revolution. For Frenau, this meant that he believed in liberty for all, the idea of the common man, as the term was called, as naturally capable of reason. Notice this word naturally again, it's natural. There was a use of pastoralism in his writing. Pastoralism it has the word pastoral in there, and a pastoral writing has to do with pretty farming scenes is a quick and dirty way of explaining that. The idea that farming is somehow moral. There's the morality of the farmer involved with pretty scenes of farms. In more sophisticated parlance, we could call it the American agrarian ideal. The idea that in America there was an egalitarian society with a gentleman farmer. This is an idea popularized by Thomas Jefferson. Now, let me pause here for a minute because it wasn't particularly egalitarian. Consider there were definitely gradations of social class and economic disparities, and of course, the underpinning to make these gentlemen farmers successful was the institution of slavery in America. There is also an ideal of the American Republican, put in quotation marks, based on the original Roman Republic, that runs through the writings we've been reading and runs through the writings of Frenau. The ideal of the American Republican contains these ideas of virtue, being the best American a person can be. Some other tidbits here that overlap with the biography. He is educated and political, Frenau was. Jefferson knew him, Hamilton disliked him, and Washington called him a rascal. There is some overlap here with Irving and Rip Van Winkle because both of these authors are concerned about the American Revolution, and it shows up in their writings. I wanted to circle back to the idea of the love of nature and what I'm going to call proto-romanticism in his writing, like some kind of early emergent American romanticism. The writings of Frenau, they parallel a rise of literary nationalism in America, which was very much a self-conscious movement of writers trying to bring forward American writing. They wanted to serve up American writing as something that was patriotic. In order to do that, we have Frenau playing with conventions past and present. He anticipates the love of nature of later Romantic poets that we have not only in England, but also in America. He writes in this in-between poetic style, I'll call it that, between Augustan poetry like Alexander Pope and Romantic poetry like Wordsworth and Coleridge. Frenau was educated in Latin and Greek, and I think we are safe to classify his poems as American Romanticism, but just with that idea always that it is early in the Romantic period because there are still so many features of Augustan poetry. It keeps coming up, this Augustan poetry like Alexander Pope. So I really wanted to give a detour for a lesson on prosody and scansion. So I'm going to turn away from Frenau and give some background here that I know a lot of students in the class don't have based on some questions I've asked. The term prosody means patterns of sound and rhythm in poetry. The term scansion means the act of scanning, which is decoding and marking up, like literally scanning by reading across something, but also writing on a line of verse or poetry to discover its meter. Meter here means rhythmical pattern. I'm going to break that down a little bit more now. Scansion is to mark the lines of a poem. Now, you don't have to memorize any of this. It's here for you to return to and to use as a reference. When poems are scanned, often it's done in handwriting. It's not the easiest thing to do with a keyboard. Here are some marks that are used. They can be replicated on a keyboard, as you can even see from the sort of handwriting and the lines that are used here. The little U is an unacted syllable, kind of like a downbeat. The accent mark is used to accent a syllable or make it like louder, basically. A slash is used to break between poetic feet, and sometimes you'll see lines that are totally vertical that separate some meter. I'll show you that here in a minute. And then you'll see two lines sometimes for something called a caesura or a metrical pause. It's like a longer pause. Here it is a little bit slowed down. To scan poetry, part 1, you would mark stressed and unstressed syllables looking for syllable patterns. So stressed, again, that accent mark. Unstressed is the little U. Here it is in action. Angel. Okay, so the front part of that is stressed. The last part is not. Complete. Well, the second half of the word is getting the stress there. Recommend. Da, da, da. Okay, so it goes to like unstressed and a stressed. Entertainment. Ooh, that one's a little bit harder. Da, 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 da. So you really have to kind of exaggerate it and be willing to be loud a little bit and say it out loud in order to figure out where these beats are. Now, everyone has probably heard of iambic pentameter by now. Shakespeare, this is usually where it's introduced. Sorry for the fuzziness of it, but getting screenshots on these kinds of things, not always the easiest. But we have an iamb here on the left, represented there with the shoes on the right. Da-dum, da-dum. Here it is with Shakespeare. To be or not to be. That is the question. All right, a little irregular at the end of the line, but irregularities, well, they have to come into play. It's unavoidable. So there you have the most common known iambic pentameter. Da, 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 da. So what's meter? Meter, patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables, bringing this back around. The basic unit of meter is called a foot. There are 5 patterns of feet that I'm going to put here. The iamb, da-da, the trochee, dun-dun, anapest, da-da-da, dactyl, dun-dun-dun, and a spondy, da-da. No, I even like messed that one up, didn't I? It's hard to say that one. Da-da. It's like, we don't use those very often in English. They're actually hard to say. So again, not memorizing this, so I am going through this pretty quickly, but I want to expose you to something you may not know much about, and something I think you maybe want to know more about, or at least think about the overlap with how this works with music and even rap. All right, here are some iambs. I asked my mother for 50 cents to see the elephant jump the fence. Okay, there's some parts that are irregular. You can see little X's and highlights. He jumped so high, he touched the sky, and he did not come back till the 4th of July. And you see da-da-da-da-da-da at the end. The da-da-da-da-da-da at the end actually helps close off the poem. Forced changes like that, forced shifts often make an end. If you're looking or want to go backwards, you'd see those are 2 anapests. But wait, there's just so much more than iambs. Here's a handy table again. It got chopped off here. The first one, destroy, da-dun. That's an iamb. The next one's a trochee, dun-dun, like the word topsy, solid, sinking. Then there's an anapest, da-dun, intervene, and the song. Then there's a dactyl, dun-dun-dun, merrily, Kennedy, Cassidy, spondy. That's your 2 that sound the same. Boxcar. Yeah, that's a little easier. And then there's another one, Pyrrhic. We don't see this very often. Both are unstressed in a row. The sea, son of. Those are usually used to kind of calm down the sound. Let's take a look at some trochaic feet here. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. There's some irregularity. If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, where's the peck of pickled peppers that Peter Piper picked? You see it ends with some iambs there. Again, the shift at the end brings it to a close. Here's some anapestic feet. There was an old man in a tree who was horribly bored by a bee. When they said, "Does it buzz?" he replied, "Yes, it does. It's a regular brood of a bee." Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Dactyls. Follow her down to a bridge by a fountain where rocking horse people eat marshmallow pies. Everyone smiles as you drift past the flowers that grow so incredibly high. This is the Beatles. Lucy in the sky with diamonds, etc. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Spondaic feet. It's rarely an entire line. You'll see why. Spondies, the double stress. See, saw, Marjorie Daw. I scream, you scream. Okay, we know this one. We all scream for ice cream. The I scream, you scream part. Those are spondies. So Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote a poem about Scansion. It's kind of cute, so I threw it in here. Trochee trips from long to short, from long to long and solemn sort. Slow, spondy stalks, strong foot, yet ill able ever to come up with dactyl trisyllable. Iambics march from short to long, with a leap and a bound the swift anapes strong, one syllable long, with one short at each side. And for bracks, haste with a steady stride, first and last being long, middle short. Amphimacer strikes his thundering hoofs like a proud hybrid racer. Yikes, not easy to read. There's even some in here that I didn't mention earlier. And, well, hats off to Coleridge for actually writing this using the very pieces of meter that he is writing about. Meter also has rising and falling aspects to it. Iambics rise, da-da. Anapes rise, da-da-da. Falling feet, they go the stress first. Trochaic, dun-dun. Dactylic, dun-dun-dun. So the rising and the falling, they give the sounds feeling and character when we read them. All right, a little bit more vocabulary for this very quick deep dive we're doing. A caesura is a pause within a line. It's indicated by a double line when scanning. Another term is an end-stopped line, a pause at the end of a line. It reflects normal speech patterns and typically marked with punctuation. You don't always see punctuation at the end of poetry lines. And jammin' is when you run from one line to another. It's also called a run-on line. These things really affect how we read poetry, and it takes practice and a lot of it. People who aren't particularly skilled or who haven't practiced reading a particular poem, they'll make mistakes in where these pauses go. To scan poetry, how do you do it? You break the words into sets or patterns. You break up the syllables. You mark those sets with a vertical line. Again, those sets are called feet or metrical feet. Let's take a look at Hamlet again. See the sets? Those are your feet. To be or not to be? That is the question. You can count the feet or sets in a line. There's all sorts of terms for this too. Monometer or manometer, dimeter, trimeter, tetrameter, pentameter, hexameter, septameter, octameter, and on it goes. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet, and 6. Just kind of a different version of the same here. Try it. Write your name, figure out the stressed and the unstressed syllables, the meter, and see if your own name divides into feet. You could try it with your first name, a nickname, your last name, versions of your name. Give it a shot, see what you get, have a little fun with it. And thanks for watching part 1 of this lecture.